Hey, I'm Bob Wormsley, and in this constraints tutorial, we'll look at the settings that help us with liquids. We'll look at surface tension to make these really nice water droplets. We'll look at the viscosity tab to help make these gloopy liquids. And we'll look at the friction settings that can help with granular sims like this wet sand. So let's get started. In this scene we have a cube and it has a collider tag on it. We also have an X-particles emitter, which is spitting out these particles in an hexagonal grid, emitting on one frame only, and they have no speed. And we've also got a gravity in the scene. So if we press play, we just get these particles falling to the bottom of this cube, and it doesn't look very exciting. So let's use this to have a look at some of the other constraints features. So let's just get organized straight away. We'll go to the X-particles menu and we'll pick XP system sort, which will put all of these existing X-particles objects into a system hierarchy. I'm just going to deselect icon in viewport. Right, so let's bring in a dynamic object. We'll bring in a dynamics constraints and let's have a look. So there are three types of constraints which have somewhat been superseded by the newer and the improvements made to the fluid solvers in X-particles, and they are viscosity, friction, and surface tension, which all kind of do fluid simulations. But just because we have got these similar features in newer, more improved fluid solvers doesn't mean that these features are now defunct. They definitely have their uses. So what I'm going to do to demonstrate these, I'm going to use them in conjunction with another dynamics object. And we're going to go to the dynamics folder and I'm going to bring in a fluid PBD solver. So I'm just going to switch off the constraints for now. So the fluid PBD solver is making these particles behave in a fluid-like way. And you see that as we go down, they're now being pushed apart and they're kind of interacting with each other and forming pools of water. Now, it's very low resolution. There's not that many particles and they're quite a big radius. So obviously it's not ultra-realistic fluid, but you can see that they're behaving in that way. So with this base liquid simulation, I can now start looking at some of these constraints features and we can see exactly what they do. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off with surface tension. So with surface tension, let's go to the surface tension tab. And what I'm going to do is let's just leave these as they are and let's activate surface tension and see what happens. So the particles have moved into themselves and they're kind of forming what look like globules or drops of water. So if we just start the sim from the beginning, we can see that they come into each other much more quickly and form these like water droplets. If I increase this tension amount, they become tighter droplets of water. And so what's happening here is that these are given, the water globules have been given this surface tension. And the way to think about this is if you think of water, a water droplet that's perhaps dripping down the windshield of a car, that water droplet isn't just one water particle. It's several water particles, but they form this kind of skin, which becomes a droplet. And that skin is formed by the outside of the water, creating this tension. And that means that we can create and get our particles to behave a little bit like water droplets. If I reduce that tension, it relaxes them slightly. If we increase the tension, it makes them come together. And what it's trying to do, it forces all of these particles to try and take up as little surface area as possible. So we've got very similar settings that we're used to from the other constraints, especially the connections. We have a particle connections limit, we have a search radius, and we have this inner amount. So let's just increase this limit up to 50. So now more particles can have this force. And you can see now we've increased the limit. We're getting much more kind of three-dimensional water droplets. If I reduce the tension, you see it's flattening out, increase the surface tension, and they will bunch together and become water droplets again as they're trying to inhabit as little surface area as possible for that amount of particles. And the reason we have this inner radius is so that they don't all collapse onto each other. If we put that onto 0, you'll see that they kind of all collapse. Now, they're not collapsing too badly because we've got our fluid PBD active, which is forcing these particles to not intersect. But if we didn't have that, without this inner measurement, they wouldn't stay separated and they would just kind of collapse on each other. So we're getting this interesting water droplet look by increasing the surface tension of this liquid, and it's fantastic. If you wanted to do a real kind of macro shot of a water droplet dripping out of a vessel, this is going to get you that type of look. You can see that this one, as the groups join each other, they don't just join as a circular mass, they kind of gradually kind of loop in and change and swallow it up, and then this one swallows it up, and then they try and again inhabit as little surface area as possible. And it's quite mesmerizing to watch, really. So surface tension gives you these fantastic droplet effects. So just to reiterate that, let's just get our emitter, and I'm going to copy it. So just hit Control or Command and make a duplicate. And the duplicate one, I'm just going to go to the display and I'm going to change this gradient knot. So it's a slightly different colour. So let's change it to a green. And we'll change that one to a green, to a lighter green. Right, okay, and then so we've got one constraint object, but two different emitters. And what you'll see is it doesn't care which emitter the particles come from. As it creates this surface tension globule, it just becomes one homogenized mass, even though these are particles from different emitters. And if we can, let's just see if we can try and break this one up a little bit. By what could we do? Let's add a motion modifier, turbulence, and see if we can kind of get those to break up. So now the turbulence is going to try and break them up, but then they're going to reform into other blobs, and then reform into other blobs, and they're creating this really interesting droplet effects using surface tension. So that in its own right is a fantastic effect. If you're looking for kind of getting some nice realism of droplets off maybe water off a leaf or drops on a windshield, that type of thing. But also this is nice. I can imagine this has been some kind of medical animation taking place in a petri dish or something along those lines. So that is constraints surface tension, which at the moment I'm using in conjunction with the X Particles fluid PBD. So let's take another look at the dynamics constraints object, and the other fluid type solve that we have is the viscosity tab, and this is used to help create those really thick, gloopy, viscous liquids like honey or like glue. So in this scene we have this box emitter, and it is spitting out particles on the first frame in a regular emission mode with a radius of 6, and that doesn't have any speed, so we're getting this regular grid. We have a gravity modifier pulling the particles down, and we have these various different collision objects. So if we hit play without any constraints, we're just going to get this very boring, uniform sliding down of particles as the gravity takes hold. So let's use our constraints to turn these particles into a gloopy kind of liquid-like form. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to activate the collisions, because we don't want, we're having these particles born and we want them to intersect as little as possible. So we'll activate those, and then we'll go to viscosity and let's switch it on. So if I resim those particles, you'll see that we have connected particles. So this looks very similar to when we use the connections birth, distance, and custom. We get these physically connected particles. We also get that with viscosity, even though it's a kind of fluid solver. But they work in a very different way. So if I just hit play, let's leave it all on default, see what happens. We hit play. So you can see that these connections are stretching, they're breaking on their own, and as the particles slip down, it's stretching a bit, and some of them are breaking off, and it's kind of simulating a gloopy-like fluid. And if we go to our viscosity settings, again, we've got some very, very familiar looking settings to the other connections. We have a connection limit, how many each particle can be connected to. We have a search radius, in this instance it's 40 centimeters, and we have a stiffness value, that's it. Now one thing you will see is that we are missing any kind of braking options, but these constraints are braking, but it just happens as an automatic process as part of this viscosity calculation. So if I increase the stiffness of this viscosity, these will be more difficult to stretch and to expand, and that's going to give the feel and look of a much thicker liquid. Look, as it's hanging down, it's hanging on, and it's hanging on and causing a much bigger kind of drip, and eventually it's being pulled down into this big gloop. If we reduce that stiffness, it'll stretch much more easily and they'll break apart more easily, and that will give the effect of a much less viscous fluid. See, they're falling down much more quickly and the constraints aren't as tough. Let's just add a few more frames to that timeline. And so let's just put that stiffness back up and we'll resim. So now we've got a really thick, viscous liquid that's moving and being held together much more strongly. It will still stretch, it will still break eventually, but the stiffness is going to keep those springs from expanding too much until the weight becomes too unbearable. So now we've got a really big one, and now it's starting to stretch, and it's glooping down and pulling the rest of it with it. And this is an incredibly stiff liquid that this is simulating. So that is the constraint viscosity, which in its own right can get you some fantastic kind of particle effects, but it's also incredibly useful when used alongside one of the other X-Particles fluid solvers, especially the fluid PBD, which we'll explore in another video. So in this scene, we're going to look at our dynamics constraints object, and we're going to look at the friction tab. Now this, like viscosity and surface tension, is used to simulate a fluid sim using constraints. In friction's case, it's simulating like a grains solve, a granular solve. So what we've got in this scene, without any of our constraints active, is this box emitter, and it's spitting out particles, and they're rebounding and colliding with this scene geometry. And we've got a gravity in this scene as well, which is what's pulling these grains to the floor. So what we're able to do, let's go to our constraints. First of all, we are going to want collisions active because we don't want these particles intersecting. So let's activate those collisions. That immediately changes the look of the sim, doesn't it? They're colliding with each other and colliding off all over the place. And even just with collisions, it feels more dynamic and more realistic, like there's some kind of actual physics going on. But what we want to do is use friction to simulate these particles kind of almost sticking to each other, so we can simulate dry to even wet, clumpy sand, for example, or slushy snow. So how might we do that? Well, let's go to our friction tab and we'll activate our friction. And just on the default settings, let's hit play and see what happens. So straight away we can see a difference, can't we? These are holding together and they're kind of clumping a bit. And as they fall down here, look, they're lying on top of each other. And they're not looking particularly realistic, but we're getting this effect where this looks like kind of wet, muddy sand dropping off and some of the particles are clumping around together. So what is happening with this sim? Well, the settings, some of them look familiar. We have a weight, and this is how you can blend the friction with the rest of the constraints. We'll just leave that on 100% for now. And then we have a particle limit like we do in most of these constraints. So this says that we have a particle search radius of 30 centimeters. A particle will look in a 30 centimeter radius, and if it finds any particles within that radius, it will apply the friction force to it up to a limit of 16 particles. So that's the same as it works in all of the other ones. But then the other settings look slightly different. And what we have is an overall friction strength. At the moment is 80%. So if I put this friction strength down to 16, say, you should see that it's much less cohesive, and this is much more like dry sand. If we put that way up, then it starts behaving in a much more blobby like wet sand, because the particles have more and more friction. They're kind of not letting each other slide away. And we can see that we're getting this kind of clumping at the bottom. So that's the overall friction slider. But then we have these two other settings, static and kinetic here. And what this means is the static is a percentage of this radius. So what it's saying is, let's just put it down to 50% to make the calculations easier. So what this is saying is, particles that are within 50% of this search radius, so that's 15 centimeters, will be considered static, will have static friction, and they'll stop them from moving each other. Particles which are over 50% of this radius, so over 15 centimeters, will be considered kinetic, moving friction. And then this gives you a strength slider of those remaining particles. So in reality, I haven't used and adjusted the kinetic setting that much, really. I've pretty much leave these on default, and we get kind of effects that look and work. But you can delve deeper into that and start playing around with this kinetic setting. It's that moving friction. So what we have got then is this sim, which looks okay, but there's a bit of a problem. Let's say we're going for a really thick, wet sand. If I stop it, they're kind of staying quite far away from each other, and they're kind of floating down in this unrealistic way. And that's just the way in which this friction is working over this radius value. So one way maybe of getting round that would be to reduce the radius to a smaller amount, so we don't get that kind of almost floating. But this is going to fundamentally change that gloopiness now, and we're not getting that same nice cohesiveness that we were getting. So let's put that back to 30 and run it again. So what might we do using just this friction and the constraints to make this feel a bit more realistic? Well, let's use it in conjunction with one of our other forces, which will force these particles to come closer together so we don't have these big gaps. So let's do that with the forces tab. So we'll go to forces, we'll activate particle forces, and I'm going to take off repulsion, because I just want the particles to be attracted to each other a little bit more. So let's just put the attraction up to 5 and leave it at a 20 centimeter radius. Just leave it default. So what I'm hoping for now is that we're going to get slightly more clumped together but wet particles. Let's have a look. I think it looks like it's working already. Yes, and now they're much closer together and they're clumping and falling down on top of each other. So that is an interesting look. I'm liking that. Let's watch it drop down. So that's looking really nice. So we could even try, let's go back to the friction. Let's try upping the connection limit to see whether we can get this to feel even more stiff. We may not. They may have reached their limit within this radius, but let's just have a look. Here they come. Okay, and that's really glooping down and falling down on each other. Excellent. So let's just try, maybe just try fractionally less attraction. Because what I would like, if possible, is for them to lie on top of each other just a little bit more as they get down to this bottom area. So let's just have a look. Here they come. Yes, they're piling up a bit better now. Yes. Okay. So that's looking pretty nice. So this is obviously a very, very kind of wet, gloopy kind of sand or a slushy snow type effect. I mean, it's almost like a viscous liquid, isn't it? Or we could just put that friction way down and we should get a different sim. Now, we've still got the attractive force happening here, so we may need to reduce that slightly. But there, we can see that that's much more runny. So with a more sand-like, we probably want less attraction. So let's put that just way down to 0.5. Yeah, and that's running a bit more like a wetter sand, but it's still kind of clumping and falling and gripping together at the bottom. So the friction in constraints can be used along with other constraints to simulate kind of low resolution grains simulations. But obviously, really, if you want to do a nice grain solve, I would urge you to use FluidFX and to use the grains solver within that, which is far more robust. And you can get far more in depth and get much more realistic grains sims. But friction can be used with other constraints to get that look. What else it is good for is actually nothing to do with grains. I'm just going to go to my window and open another scene to demonstrate this. So in this scene, this is similar to the scene that I demonstrated to you when we were looking at the constraints forces. We've got some attractive and repulsive forces with these different size particles, and that means that we're getting this kind of really nice, really energetic flocking, and then they're being attracted towards this null star. And it's quite an interesting look, and it works well. But let's just say I want to activate this turbulence for a bit more erratic movement. But the turbulence is pretty strong, and the particles are now going, well, they're going pretty mental, aren't they? So what would be nice is if we could have this erratic turbulent movement, but just calm them down a little bit. So what we're able to do is use constraints and the friction constraint to suck a bit of energy out of this very erratic dynamic simulation. So let's do that. We'll go to our constraints. Let's go to the friction tab. And this is all just defaults. Let's switch it on. Let's wait for these to kind of settle around on our star. Switch it on. And straight away, look at that. So we have really, really taken out a huge amount of the energy from this sim. It's still working, but actually the friction amount is so great that we've destroyed all of that movement. This may be the look that you want, but all we can do now, you can either adjust our individual friction settings, or we can just dial down the weight until we get a little bit more erratic movement, but it's not completely over the top as it was before. And bring that weight down. So there we go. So now we're getting something that's still looking quite nice and dynamic. It's still got that erratic, strong, turbulent movement, but we've used our friction with this really nice subtlety of the weight slider to just dampen down the erraticness of that particle interaction. And this can be used in all kinds of different scenes. When you have some dynamics with constraints and things tend to get a little bit out of control because of the energy you've brought into the scene, use the friction slider to just take away some of that excess energy and slow things down a little bit.